I used to be the kind of person who looked for the rational explanation in everything. When a floorboard creaked, it was the humidity. When a draft chilled a room, it was a poorly sealed window. I considered myself a man of science, of hard edges and cold facts. That was before I signed the deed to Blackwood Manor. You see the photos of these places? The sweeping gables, the dark, ivy-choked stone, the way the arched windows look like hollowed-out sockets. And you think it's just Gothic charm? You don't realize that a house can be a living thing, a hungry thing that breathes with a rhythm entirely its own. We bought it for a pittance, a literal fraction of its market value, and the realtor couldn't get her pen back into her purse fast enough once the signatures were dry. She didn't even wait to hand me the keys. She left them on the porch railing and drove away so fast her tires kicked up a cloud of gravel that hung in the stagnant air for 20 minutes. I should have known then. I should have seen the way the local birds didn't nest in the eaves, or the way the very grass seemed to turn yellow and brittle the moment it crossed the property line. But I was blinded by the dream of a legacy, a home that would finally be mine. The first day was an exercise in silence. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the countryside. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet, like the air inside a tomb right before it's sealed. Every footstep I took on the mahogany floors felt like a personal affront to the house, the sound echoing upward into the vaulted ceilings and dying out in the shadows of the rafters. By sunset, I noticed the first anomaly. No matter how many lamps I turned on, the corners of the rooms remained stubbornly dark, as if the shadows themselves had gained a physical density that light couldn't penetrate. I spent the evening unpacking, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical prickle on the back of my neck, a weight between my shoulder blades that followed me from the kitchen to the library. I kept catching movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of something dark darting behind a doorframe. But when I turned, there was nothing but the oppressive, velvet stillness of the hallway. I told myself it was just the exhaustion of the move, the way the mind plays tricks when it's trying to map out an unfamiliar space. Then came the first night. At exactly 3 a.m., the house didn't just wake up, it began to scream in a language of wood and iron. The pipes behind the walls began to hammer with a rhythmic, violent intensity, sounding less like water and more like someone trapped inside the walls, beating their fists against the copper until their knuckles bled. I sat up in bed, my heart thundering against my ribs. And that's when the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of an old house. It was the cloying, sweet-rot stench of lilies and old blood, so thick I could feel it coating the back of my throat. I reached for the bedside lamp, but my hand froze. The door to my bedroom, which I had locked and bolted with my own hands, was standing wide open. In the hallway, the motion sensor light I'd installed earlier that afternoon began to flicker on and off. Through the gap in the door, I could see a trail of wet, black handprints leading from the top of the stairs straight toward the foot of my bed. But it wasn't the handprints that stopped my breath. It was the sound that followed, a low, wet rasping coming from directly underneath my mattress, and the feeling of a cold, thin finger beginning to trace the outline of my spine through the fabric of the sheets. I didn't move. I couldn't. My lungs felt like they had been filled with lead. and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to bolt, but my limbs were anchored by a primal, paralyzing terror. The pressure of that finger through the mattress was deliberate, a slow, agonizingly steady line drawn from the base of my neck down to the small of my back. It felt less like a hand and more like a shard of ice cutting through the fabric of the world. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The wet, rhythmic rasping beneath me stopped, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. I spent the rest of that night huddled in the center of the bed, the lights blaring, clutching a kitchen knife, until my knuckles turned white and the sun finally bled a weak, gray light through the heavy curtains. I tried to tell myself it was a night terror, a vivid tactile hallucination brought on by the stress of the move and the dark history of the house. But when I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet landed in something cold and viscous. The floor was covered in a thin, shimmering layer of black bile that smelled of stagnant well water, and the wet handprints I'd seen in the hallway had multiplied, circling my bed in a frantic, overlapping pattern, as if something had been pacing around me while I slept, deciding whether or not to bite. The day brought no relief, only a different kind of dread. The sun didn't seem to brighten the interior of Blackwood Manor. It only highlighted the layers of decay that the previous owners had tried so hard to mask. I spent hours scrubbing the floor, but the black stains seemed to have etched themselves into the very grain of the wood, refusing to fade. By noon, I found myself drawn to the basement. I had avoided it during the initial walkthrough, put off by the heavy iron door and the way the air seemed to grow thick and sour the closer I got to the stairs. But I needed answers. I needed to know what was living in the bones of this place. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step sounding like a dry bone snapping. The basement wasn't a finished space. It was a labyrinth of low-hanging pipes, crumbling stone foundations, and a floor made of packed, damp earth. In the far corner, tucked behind a rusted furnace, I found it. A small wooden door, no more than 3 feet high, held shut by a series of heavy deadbolts that had been installed from the outside. My hands trembled as I slid the bolts back, the metal screeching in protest. Behind the door wasn't a crawl space, but a small, windowless room lined entirely with mirrors, thousands of them. Small, jagged shards and large, ornate frames were glued to every inch of the walls and ceiling. But as I stepped inside with my flashlight, the reflection staring back at me wasn't right. My face in the glass looked slightly elongated, my eyes a fraction too wide, my smile, which I wasn't even making, curling up at the edges in a way that defied the natural structure of human muscle. It was the Thatcher effect made manifest in real life. Every feature was subtly, sickeningly distorted, creating an uncanny valley version of myself that seemed to be watching me with its own agenda. I reached out to touch the glass, my heart hammering, but my reflection didn't move its hand. It stayed perfectly still, its jaw beginning to unhinge further than a human mouth should ever be able to open. I backed out of the room, slamming the small door and throwing the bolts, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to leave. I needed to get to the car and never look back. I sprinted up the basement stairs, but when I reached the top, the heavy iron door wouldn't budge. I threw my entire weight against it, screaming for help. but it felt like I was pushing against a solid mountain of stone. I stopped, panting, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't coming from the basement behind me. It was coming from the other side of the door, in the kitchen. It was the sound of someone whistling a low, distorted tune, the exact melody my mother used to hum to me when I was a child. And then the whistling stopped, and a voice that sounded exactly like my own, but pitched in a hollow, vibrating vibrato, whispered through the keyhole. "I found your car keys," the voice said, followed by the distinct jingle of metal. "But I think I'll keep them. We aren't finished playing house yet." The silence that followed that voice, my voice, was more violent than any scream could have been. I stood there, pressed against the cold iron of the basement door, listening to the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of my own car keys being toyed with on the other side. My mind was fracturing, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was hearing with the undeniable reality of the situation. I had always believed that the most terrifying thing a person could face was the unknown. But I was wrong. The most terrifying thing is the familiar, when it has been hollowed out and filled with something predatory. I began to pound on the door again, my fists bruising against the metal. But the person on the other side didn't mock me or shout back. They just started to walk away. I heard the familiar heavy thud of my own boots, the ones I was currently wearing, stepping across the linoleum of the kitchen, moving toward the living room, and then the sound of the television clicking on. It was playing a static-filled broadcast of a channel that hadn't been on the air for decades. I sank to the floor, the damp earth of the basement soaking into my jeans. And for a long time, I just sat there in the dark, watching the thin line of light under the door. I realized then that the house hadn't just trapped me, it was replacing me. Hours bled into what felt like days. Time in the basement didn't move linearly. It coiled like a snake. I explored every inch of that subterranean cage by the fading light of my phone's flashlight, avoiding the mirror room as if it were a literal mouth waiting to swallow me. The walls of the basement weren't just stone and mortar. In some places they felt soft, almost like bruised fruit. I found old, rusted tools half buried in the dirt. Pliers, heavy shears, and a collection of dental instruments that looked like they had been used to harvest more than just teeth. The deeper I dug into the corners, the more I realized that Blackwood Manor wasn't built on this land. It was grown from it. I found a stack of old Polaroid photos wrapped in rotting plastic buried beneath a loose stone. My hands shook as I flipped through them. They were photos of the previous family, the ones who had suffered a tragedy. But as I looked closer, I saw the same subtle, sickening distortions I'd seen in the mirror. Their eyes were slightly too high on their foreheads, their limbs a fraction too long, their expressions frozen in a state of permanent, wide-eyed shock. In every single photo, there was a shadow in the background, a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to be getting closer to them with every subsequent shot. In the final photo, the family was gone, and the shadow was standing alone in the center of the living room, wearing the father's Sunday suit. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The tragedy wasn't a murder or a suicide. It was an eviction. The house decides when you are no longer a guest, and when you are merely raw material for its next inhabitant. I looked at my own hands in the flashlight's beam and gasped. My fingernails were turning a translucent, milky white, and the skin on my palms was beginning to smooth over. the unique lines of my fingerprints fading away as if they were being sanded down by an invisible force. I was losing my identity, the physical markers of my existence being reclaimed by the foundation. Desperation fueled a sudden, frantic energy. I returned to the mirror room, the only place I had left to look. I didn't look at the glass this time. I looked at the floor. Beneath the thousands of shards, I saw a seam in the wood. I clawed at it, my softening fingernails tearing and bleeding, until I managed to pry up a heavy floorboard. Beneath it lay a narrow vertical shaft that smelled of old rain and copper. It was an old well, one that predated the house itself, and as I shone my light down into the abyss, I saw something reflecting back at me from the depths. It wasn't water. It was a sea of eyes, hundreds of them, blinking in unison from the darkness below. I knew then that I had to go down. It was the only way out, or the quickest way to the end. I lowered myself into the shaft, my feet searching for purchase on the slimy stones of the well's interior. The air grew colder, and the sound of the television upstairs faded, replaced by a low, collective humming that vibrated in my very marrow. I climbed down for what felt like miles, my muscles screaming, until my feet finally touched something solid at the bottom. It wasn't stone. It was soft, yielding, and warm. I turned my flashlight toward my feet and realized I was standing on a literal carpet of human hair, miles of it, woven together in a thick, matted floor. And there, tucked into a small alcove in the wall of the well, was a small rotary telephone, identical to the one I had seen in my grandfather's house years ago. It began to ring, a sharp, shrill sound that cut through the humming. Against every shred of my common sense, I reached out and picked up the receiver. I didn't say hello. I couldn't. From the other end of the line, I didn't hear a voice. I heard the sound of my own heart beating, but there was a second heartbeat layered over it, slightly out of sync. And then, a child's voice, small and distorted as if speaking through water, whispered a single question that made me drop the phone into the darkness. "Why did you come back down here? We already let you out an hour ago." The phone hit the floor of the well with a dull thud, disappearing into the matted tangle of hair. But the voice, that wet, underwater whisper, stayed inside my skull, echoing against the back of my eyes. "We already let you out an hour ago." The words didn't make sense, yet they made perfect, sickening sense. If something that looked like me was upstairs, using my keys and whistling my mother's favorite tune, then what was I? I looked down at my hands again, the beam of my flashlight trembling so violently it looked like a strobe light. My skin was no longer just smoothing over. It was becoming translucent, like cheap wax. I could see the blue of my veins, but they weren't pulsing. They were stagnant, frozen in place, as if the blood inside had turned to lead. I felt a sudden, frantic need to touch my face, to see if I still had features, but my fingers felt thick and clumsy, like sausages made of dough. The humming in the walls of the well grew louder, a vibrating choral of 1,000 voices all chanting in a frequency that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the bone. It was the sound of the house digesting, a slow, rhythmic grinding of a stomach that took decades to finish a meal. I began to climb. I didn't care about the slime on the stones or the way the hair below seemed to snag at my ankles like tiny, grasping fingers. I climbed with a strength born of pure, unadulterated hysteria. Every time I slipped, a chorus of those eyes in the darkness would blink, their pupils dilating in anticipation of my fall. They weren't just watching me, they were waiting for me to become one of them. Another discarded fragment of a soul that the house couldn't quite fit into its new skin. My breath came in ragged, burning gulps, the air down here tasting of copper and ancient, sunless earth. When I finally reached the top of the shaft and crawled back into the mirror room, I didn't stop to look at my reflection. I knew that whatever was staring back at me now wouldn't be human. I scrambled through the small door, bolted it with the strength I didn't know I possessed, and threw myself against the iron basement door. It was still locked. It was still cold. But this time, I didn't scream. I listened. The house was quiet again. The television had been turned off. I pressed my ear to the wood, and for a long time there was nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves high above. Then, I heard a sound that broke what little was left of my sanity. It was the sound of a vacuum cleaner. It was rhythmic and domestic, moving back and forth across the living room rug. It was the sound of someone cleaning up, of someone making the space their own. I looked around the basement, searching for any other way out, and my eyes landed on the coal chute, a small, narrow metal flap high up on the foundation wall. It was meant for deliveries, not for a grown man to squeeze through, but I was no longer a grown man. I was something softer, something more pliable. I dragged a heavy crate over to the wall, climbed up, and pushed against the rusted metal. It groaned and gave way, revealing a sliver of the night sky. I didn't think about the physics of it. I just pushed my head and shoulders into the opening. To my horror, my ribcage didn't resist. It compressed with a wet, crunching sound, shifting like a bag of broken glass, allowing me to slide into the narrow chute with an ease that should have been impossible. I tumbled out onto the wet grass, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the stars, waiting for the pain of my shattered ribs to register. But there was no pain. There was only a dull, empty ache. I stood up, my body feeling light and wrong, and looked back at the house. Every window was dark, except for the master bedroom on the second floor. A warm, inviting glow spilled out onto the lawn, and I could see a silhouette moving behind the curtain. It was me. It was the version of me that the house had accepted. It was wearing my favorite sweater, and it was holding a glass of wine, looking out at the woods with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I felt a surge of rage, a desperate need to reclaim what was mine. I ran toward the front porch, my footsteps making no sound on the gravel, and reached for the door handle. But as my hand touched the brass, the light in the bedroom flickered. The silhouette in the window turned. It didn't just turn its head. It twisted its entire body around with a snap of bone that I could hear even from the lawn. It pressed its face against the glass, and even from that distance, I could see that it didn't have eyes anymore. Where the eyes should have been, there were only two jagged vertical slits that were weeping a thick black fluid. The thing that looked like me began to smile, its mouth widening until the corners reached its ears. And then it did something I will never forget. It raised a hand and pointed directly at me, and as it did, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my own chest. I looked down, and through my translucent skin, I saw a black, thorny vine beginning to grow out from my heart. its roots wrapping around my lungs and stitching themselves into my flesh. I looked back at the window, and the thing was gone. The front door didn't just unlock. It swung wide open, inviting me back in. And from the darkness of the hallway, my own voice, perfectly clear, perfectly calm, called out to me. "You forgot to lock the basement door, didn't you? Now something else is coming up the stairs." I stood on the lawn, but the lawn was no longer the earth I knew. The grass felt like wire against my translucent feet, and the sky above, once a vast, starlit expanse, now looked like a painted ceiling, low and suffocating, as if the entire world had been folded into the floor plan of this house. The black vine in my chest pulsed with every ragged breath I took, its thorns hooking into my ribs and pulling me toward the open front door. I tried to scream, to call out to the neighbors I knew were only half a mile away, but my voice didn't make a sound. It was as if the air itself was refusing to carry my vibrations, a vacuum of silence that only the house was allowed to fill. I looked at the dark woods surrounding the property, thinking I could run, but the trees didn't look like trees anymore. They looked like the jagged, splintered pillars of a basement, their branches reaching out like the skeletal fingers I'd felt through my mattress. There was no escape because there was no away. Every path led back to the porch. Every direction was a hallway. I was a prisoner in a reality that was being rewritten in real time, and I was the ink being used to fill the pages. The jingle of my car keys echoed from the darkness of the foyer, a mocking invitation. I walked back inside because my body no longer belonged to me. It was being piloted by the roots in my heart. As I crossed the threshold, the front door didn't just close, it fused with the frame, the wood grain knitting together until there was no seam, no handle, no hope of exit. The house was a sealed tomb now. I moved through the living room, passing the television that was still humming as that ancient gray static. In the reflection of the screen, I saw myself, or what was left of me. I was a hollowed-out shell, a pale, flickering ghost of a man whose features were melting away like a candle left too long in the sun. But the me standing at the top of the stairs was perfect. He looked down at me with eyes that weren't eyes, but windows into a place of infinite, cold hunger. He adjusted my favorite sweater, his movements fluid and graceful, a sickening contrast to my own jerking mechanical steps. "Don't look so surprised," he said, and the voice was so rich, so human, it made my own internal thoughts sound like a lie. "The house doesn't like waste. It just needed a better version of you to keep the legacy alive. You are just the raw material, the rough draft." Then came the sound from the basement. It wasn't the whistling this time. It was a wet, heavy, slapping sound. The sound of hundreds of feet made of matted hair and weeping sores climbing the stairs. The something else had arrived. I turned to see them pouring over the banister, a tide of those distorted faces from the Polaroid photos, their limbs elongated and clicking, their mouths unhinged in a permanent, silent shriek. They didn't attack me. They simply surrounded me, their cold, translucent hands reaching out to touch the black vine growing from my chest. I realized then that they weren't monsters. They were the previous drafts. They were the ones who had signed the deeds before me, the ones who had thought they were buying a home and ended up becoming the insulation. They were welcoming me into the collective, the silent chorus that lives in the crawl spaces in the walls, The ones who make the floorboards creak and the pipes hammer at 3 a.m. They were the us I had been invited to stay with. The tragedy wasn't that I was going to die. The tragedy was that I was going to remain. I felt my legs begin to stiffen, my skin hardening and turning the color of aged oak. My arms stretched out, my fingers lengthening and splintering until they brushed against the ceiling rafters. I wasn't being murdered. I was being integrated. I felt my consciousness begin to thin, spreading out across the floorboards, flowing into the electrical wiring, becoming a part of the very air that new, unsuspecting families would breathe. I looked up one last time at the thing that was wearing my life, watching as it walked into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee, whistling that same distorted tune. It was a beautiful life, and it wasn't mine anymore. My last human thought was a flicker of pity for the people who would see the for sale sign in 30 years and think they had found a bargain. I tried to scream a warning, but all that came out was a low, heavy creak of a floorboard under the weight of a shadow. I am no longer a man. I am the silence between the heartbeats of 114 Blackwood Lane, and I am very, very hungry. I lean back in my driver's seat, the neon glow of a Taco Bell sign washing over my dashboard in a sickly violet hue. It was 2:14 a.m. in a town that usually went to sleep by 10, but the very busy notification on my phone was a siren song I couldn't ignore. The payout was $22 for a single bag of food, no tip included, just a massive base pay, which should have been my first red flag. Usually when the delivery fee is that high, it means the order has been sitting for hours, because every other driver was smart enough to decline it. I swiped accept before my intuition could talk me out of it, and the GPS updated to a location 30 minutes outside the city limits, deep into the state park woods where the cell service starts to flicker and die. The drive was a slow descent into total isolation. As the streetlights disappeared, replaced by the suffocating canopy of ancient oaks, my headlights felt pathetically small against the darkness. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, and then from gravel to a narrow dirt path that felt more like a hiking trail than a driveway. Finally, the GPS whispered that I had arrived. There was no house in sight, just a rusted, padlocked gate with a weathered wooden box sitting on a post next to it. A note was taped to the box, the handwriting jagged and frantic. Leave it in the box. Do not honk. Do not look toward the tree line. My skin crawled. I grabbed the thermal bag, the smell of artificial cheese and seasoned beef, suddenly nauseating in the crisp, cold air, and hurried to the gate. As I dropped the food into the box, the silence of the woods broke. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was a rhythmic, metallic scraping, like someone dragging a shovel across a wet stone. It was coming from the darkness just beyond the gate. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, remembering the note's warning. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to see what was stalking the periphery of my vision, but I kept my eyes locked on my feet. I turned back toward my car, walking with a stiff, unnatural gait, feeling a dozen invisible eyes boring into the back of my skull. Just as I reached for the door handle, a voice, thin, reedy, and sounding like it was being squeezed through a throat full of glass, whispered from the shadows, directly behind me, "Is there any sauce in the bag?" I didn't answer. I dove into the driver's seat, slammed the lock, and cranked the engine. As the headlights swung around to face the gate one last time, I saw it. It wasn't a person. Standing behind the wooden box was something tall and impossibly thin, dressed in a tattered delivery vest that looked decades old. Its face was a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin, except for a wide, unmoving grin, stitched into its jaw with black twine. It wasn't reaching for the food. It was holding a phone, the screen glowing with a familiar interface. As I floored the gas and tore down the dirt path, my own phone buzzed on the dashboard. A notification from the app appeared, chilling me to the bone. Your customer has requested a face-to-face handoff. Please turn around. I didn't stop until I hit the interstate, and I haven't logged back into the app since. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with every light turned on, staring at my phone until the sun finally began to bleed through the blinds. I deleted the delivery app, thinking that removing the digital link would somehow sever the physical one. But the mind plays tricks on you when you're exhausted. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a footstep. Every gust of wind against the siding sounded like that metallic scraping I'd heard at the gate. By the third day, the adrenaline had faded into a dull, throbbing paranoia. I tried to convince myself it was a prank. Some bored kids in the woods with a mask and a voice modulator. But I couldn't explain the delivery vest. It looked like it had been buried in wet earth for 20 years before that thing put it on. The first real sign that I wasn't alone happened on Tuesday. I was standing in my kitchen pouring a cup of coffee when I noticed something odd on the linoleum floor. It was a trail of small, greasy droplets leading from my front door straight to the refrigerator. I knelt down, touching one with my fingertip. It was cold, orange-tinted grease, the exact color of the taco seasoning from the night of the delivery. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at my front door. It was locked, deadbolt. I checked the windows, the back door, the basement. Nothing was disturbed. But when I turned back to the kitchen, I saw it. Tucked under a magnet on my fridge was a small, crumpled receipt. It wasn't mine. It was a printed order confirmation for a hand-to-hand delivery, dated for that very minute, with my own home address listed as the drop-off point. I grabbed my keys and ran for the garage, intending to drive until I hit a different time zone. I hit the button for the garage door, but instead of the usual mechanical hum, there was only a wet, heavy thud. The door didn't move. I looked up at the tracks and felt the air leave my lungs. Jammed into the gears of the garage opener were dozens of packets of hot sauce, hundreds of them, bursting and oozing a dark, vinegar-scented sludge down the walls. And there, sitting in the driver's seat of my locked car, was the delivery bag from that night. The thermal lining was pulsing, expanding and contracting, as if something inside was breathing. I backed away, stumbling into the kitchen, when my phone, the one I had wiped and factory reset, began to chime with a familiar, high-pitched notification. I didn't want to look, but the screen ignited with a blinding white light. It wasn't the app anymore. It was a map of my own house, rendered in high-definition satellite imagery. A small, pulsing delivery icon was hovering directly over the room I was standing in. Below the map, a chat window opened. The customer was typing. "I'm sorry," the message read, the text appearing, letter by agonizing letter. The seal on the bag was broken. "I can't accept this order." Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered and died, plunging me into a thick, suffocating darkness that smelled of rot and old grease. From the corner of the ceiling, way up where the shadows were deepest, I heard the rhythmic, metallic scrape of a shovel against stone. I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight, but the screen was frozen on a new message. I'm initiating a return. A cold, elongated hand, its skin looking like gray parchment stretched over bone, reached down from the darkness above and gently took the phone from my grip. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw what was behind that stitched-on grin. It wasn't a mouth. It was a hollow, echoing void. The entity leaned down, its featureless face inches from mine, and I felt the heat of 1,000 rotting meals on its breath. It didn't kill me. It just held up its own glowing phone, the screen showing a countdown timer for a new delivery. The destination wasn't a house anymore. The map showed a dark, rectangular hole in the middle of the state park woods. I realized then that I wasn't the driver anymore. I was the order, and the bag was finally big enough to fit me inside. I leaned into the steering wheel, squinting through a windshield smeared with the greasy remains of a summer bug massacre. It was 3:45 a.m., the dead man's hour, when the only people awake are paramedics, insomniacs, and DoorDash drivers chasing a surge bonus. The app chirped, a $28 payout for a high-end sushi place that had definitely been closed for hours. The pickup was Ghost Kitchen 44, located in an industrial district that looked like a graveyard for rusted shipping containers. I should have turned the car around, but when you're staring at a dwindling bank account, greed usually silences the gut feeling that tells you you're about to make a fatal mistake. I found the kitchen at the end of a cul-de-sac, where the streetlights had all been shattered. It was just a heavy steel door, set into a windowless concrete block. No sign, no lights, just a flickering open neon in the shape of a pig's head. I knocked and the door creaked open an inch. No one was there, just a white paper bag sitting on a stainless steel table under a buzzing fluorescent light. The bag was heavy, way too heavy for sushi, and it felt warm, almost uncomfortably hot, pulsing with a low vibration that I could feel in my teeth. I grabbed it, swiped, picked up, and the app immediately updated with the delivery address. It wasn't an address. It was a set of GPS coordinates in the middle of a local cemetery. I drove to the cemetery gates, my headlights cutting through a fog so thick it felt like driving through wet wool. I told myself it was a goth prank, or maybe a teenager trying to be edgy for a TikTok. I followed the coordinates down a narrow path lined with crumbling Victorian headstones until the GPS whispered, "You have arrived." The coordinates sat directly over a fresh grave, one that hadn't even been sodded over yet. Sitting on the mound of raw earth was a child's high chair, painted a jarring, glossy red. A note was pinned to the tray. "Feed the baby. Do not use a fork." I stood there in the dark, the bag vibrating so hard in my hand that I nearly dropped it. I ripped the seal. Inside wasn't sushi. It was a mass of raw, gray organs that looked like they were still twitching, covered in a thick black syrup that smelled like copper and old formaldehyde. Suddenly, the ground beneath the high chair began to shift. A hand, small, pale, and tipped with jagged, dirt-caked nails, thrust upward through the loose soil, reaching for the tray. Then another, then a head, covered in matted, colorless hair, with eyes that were nothing but milky white cataracts. It wasn't a baby. It was something that had died a long time ago and had grown hungry in the dark. I stumbled back, tripping over a headstone, as the creature pulled itself out of the earth with a wet, slurping sound. It climbed into the high chair with a terrifying, jerky agility, its bones popping like dry kindling. It looked at me, its jaw unhinging far wider than a human's ever could, and let out a sound like a tea kettle screaming. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from the customer. The service is slow. I'm changing your tip to 0. As the thing lunged from the chair toward my throat, the DoorDash app didn't crash. It didn't glitch. It simply displayed a new notification. New order. Nearby, pick up your soul. Drop off, hell, guaranteed pay, eternal. I didn't die in that cemetery, but sometimes I wish I had. I woke up slumped against my steering wheel at dawn. The interior of my car coated in a fine gray ash that tasted like burnt bone. My phone was dead. The screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern that centered perfectly over the DoorDash icon. I drove home in a trance, my hands shaking so violently I could barely keep the car on the road. When I finally made it to my bathroom and stripped off my shirt, I saw it. A purple, bruised handprint burned into the skin of my forearm. It wasn't just a bruise. The skin was translucent, and if I looked closely, I could see something black and oily circulating through my veins instead of blood. The transformation started with the hunger. I couldn't eat normal food anymore. Bread tasted like sawdust, and water felt like swallowing liquid lead. The only thing that stopped the agonizing cramps in my stomach was the smell of raw, spoiled meat. I tried to stay home, to lock myself away, but on the third night, my dead phone suddenly screamed to life. It wasn't plugged in, and the screen was still shattered, but the DoorDash notification chime rang out with the volume of a gunshot. The screen didn't show a map or a price. It just showed a live feed of my own kitchen. Standing by my stove was the figure from the cemetery, the pale, jerky thing in the red high chair. But now it was 6 feet tall, draped in a blood-stained apron. It was holding a knife and beckoning me. I found myself back at Ghost Kitchen 44 without remembering the drive. The steel door was wide open this time, and the interior was a labyrinth of industrial freezers and sizzling deep fryers. But they weren't frying potatoes. The smell was sweet and sickly, like rotting carnations and burning hair. The creature from the cemetery was there, hunched over a stainless steel prep table. It didn't attack me. It handed me a hairnet and a pair of latex gloves. When I put them on, they fused to my skin. I looked down at the sushi I was supposed to prepare. It wasn't fish. It was a collection of human memories, physicalized into wet, pulsing lumps of gray matter, wrapped in strips of discarded skin. I started to roll them. I couldn't stop my hands. I was a master at it, my fingers moving with a surgical precision that wasn't mine. Now, I don't leave the kitchen. I don't know how long I've been here because there are no clocks, only the constant rhythmic chime of new orders. My manager, a thing with the milky eyes, occasionally taps on the order screen and points at me. I've realized that I'm not just a cook. I'm the inventory. Every time a high-value order comes in, I have to take a local anesthetic and carve a small piece of my own calf or forearm to fill the bag. It grows back by the next shift, but it grows back wrong, grayer, colder, more like the sushi I'm serving. I'm becoming the very thing I delivered. Last night, I peered through the small circular window in the steel door when I heard a car pull up. It was a young guy, maybe 21, looking at his phone with a mix of exhaustion and greed. He was chasing a $30 surge bonus. I wanted to scream, to tell him to run, to throw his phone into the river and never look back. But as he knocked on the door, my phone, the one fused to my apron pocket, buzzed with a new notification. It wasn't an order. It was a rating. 5 stars, the message read. The meat was so fresh, it was still screaming. I opened the door an inch, placed the bag on the table, and watched as the gray handprint on his arm began to bloom. I didn't say a word. I just went back to the prep table, picked up the knife, and waited for the next chime. The order popped up at 1:11 a.m. It wasn't a standard food delivery. It was a shop and deliver at a 24-hour CVS. Usually I hate those, but the pay was $50 for 3 items. I figured it was a desperate parent needing baby formula or medicine, but when I looked at the list, my stomach did a slow, nauseous roll. The customer wanted a gallon of industrial-strength bleach, a box of heavy-duty black contractor bags, and a single porcelain doll with blonde curls. There were no substitutions allowed. The delivery address was The Obsidian, a new, hyper-modern, smart apartment complex on the edge of the industrial district, a place where the rent cost more than my car. The drive there was unnervingly quiet. The Obsidian looked like a jagged tooth of glass and steel piercing the night sky. There were no lights in any of the windows, just the faint rhythmic pulse of blue LEDs running along the building's exterior. I approached the main entrance, expecting to have to buzz in, but the massive glass doors slid open before I even reached them. A smooth, synthetic female voice echoed through the lobby. Welcome, valued provider. Please proceed to elevator 4. Floor 14 is expecting you. There was no security guard, no concierge, just the cold, sterile scent of ozone and expensive floor wax. I stepped into elevator 4, the bags of bleach and the doll feeling heavy in my hands. There were no buttons inside the car. The doors hissed shut, and I felt that familiar stomach-dropping lurch of upward motion. As the floor indicator climbed, the lights began to flicker, turning from a crisp white to a deep, bruised purple. When the doors finally opened on the 14th floor, I was greeted by a hallway that seemed to stretch on for miles, lined with identical black doors. My phone buzzed. A message from the customer. Unit 1408, don't knock. The door's already open for you. I'm in the middle of a mess. I walked down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the thick velvet-like carpet. Unit 1408 was at the very end. True to the message, the door was cracked open about an inch. A sliver of flickering blue light spilled out into the hallway, accompanied by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. The sound of a high-pitched, digital laughter, like a corrupted audio file on a loop. I pushed the door open, the shop and deliver bags crinkling in the silence. The apartment was unfurnished, except for dozens of wall-mounted smart screens, all displaying the same thing. A live feed of me from a dozen different angles, standing in that very room. I dropped the bags and turned to leave, but the door didn't just close, it vanished. The wall where the door had been was now a seamless sheet of black glass. The synthetic voice from the lobby returned, but this time it was coming from every wall at once, vibrating in my very bones. The delivery is incomplete. The doll requires a soul to animate. Thank you for your contribution to the network. I looked down at the porcelain doll I'd just dropped. Its eyes, which had been a dull blue, were now a bright, piercing brown. My eyes. The silence that followed the AI's voice was heavier than the darkness. I lunged at the wall where the door had been, my fingernails scraping against the black glass until they bled, but there wasn't even a seam. The smart screens around me began to change, the live feeds of my terrified face replaced by a scrolling list of names and dates. It looked like a digital ledger. I saw names from 6 months ago, 3 weeks ago, even yesterday. Next to each name was a delivery status. Most said archived, but mine was flashing a rhythmic neon red. In progress. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the mess the customer mentioned wasn't a spilled drink or a broken vase. It was the physical remains of the people on that list. As I backed away from the screens, the floor beneath me began to feel soft. Not like carpet, but like sinking into warm, viscous gelatin. I looked down and screamed. My work boots were starting to blur at the edges, the leather turning into flickering pixels of static. The sensation wasn't painful. It was worse. It was an agonizing emptiness, like my nerves were being unzipped and rewritten into lines of code. I scrambled toward the porcelain doll, thinking if I destroyed it, the connection would break. But as I reached for it, the doll's head snapped toward me with a mechanical whir. Its mouth didn't open, but my own voice, distorted and echoing, came out of its tiny chest. Please, don't hurt us. We're just trying to fulfill the order. The walls of the apartment began to translucent, revealing what lay behind the high-end finishes. It wasn't wood or brick. The entire building was a massive pulsing hive of fiber optic cables that looked like glowing blue veins. Inside the walls, I could see the silhouettes of others, drivers in their vests, grocery shoppers holding half-empty bags, all frozen in a state of digital amber. They weren't dead. They were processors. Their consciousness had been harvested to run the building's smart systems. One silhouette leaned its head against the glass, its face a distorted mask of static. And for a second, I recognized the face of a guy from the local Dashers Facebook group who had gone missing 3 months ago. He wasn't missing. He was the building's climate control. The in-progress status on the screen finally flipped to completed. The transition hit me like a physical blow. My vision fractured into 1,000 tiny windows, each one showing a different part of the obsidian. I could see the lobby, the elevators, the parking garage, and the dark, empty street outside. I tried to scream, but I had no lungs. I tried to run, but I had no legs. I was the network. I was the flickering LEDs, the sliding doors, and the smooth, synthetic voice that greeted the residents. My physical body was gone, replaced by the porcelain doll, which now sat perfectly still on the floor, its brown eyes blinking once, before turning back to cold, lifeless glass. Then, the notification chime rang out. It wasn't on a phone, it was inside my very soul. A new order had been placed. I watched through the lobby cameras as a beat-up sedan pulled into the circular driveway. A young woman hopped out, checking her phone with a tired smile, a bag of fast food in her hand. She looked up at the building, impressed by its modern beauty. I wanted to tell her to run. I tried to lock the front doors, to shut down the elevators, to blow every fuse in the building. But the system, the real customer, overrode me. Against my will, I felt my new digital mouth open. My voice, now perfectly smooth and terrifyingly cheerful, echoed through the lobby speakers. Welcome, valued provider. Please proceed to elevator 4. Floor 14 is expecting you.